and by the way, thank you so much for agreeing to do that, Nick. Um, we based this exhibit on a thesis that Betty Perry wrote in 1985 about all of the writers, children's authors and children's illustrators from Nyack and Nearby. And Nick, I don't know if you know this, but, or Sharon, but there were 119.
Wow.
That she identified of children's authors and children's illustrators. And Betty had said to us, you know, I think this really could be a very good exhibit for the Historical Society. And then when I took a look at the thesis, it was really mind-blowing. And it was very hard to identify who would be the right number of people that we could bring to this exhibit that was feasible. From the 119, many of them very, very interesting people. So when we chose 14, we really focused a lot on who were people that were very connected to Nyack, would be known to Nyack, and had really interesting stories to tell and books to read. So we all were just amazed that, well, we saw that Carson McCullers was on the list, and part of that was because she had books that were read in the high schools. But the real surprise was that she had a children's book. So we were very excited to learn about it. And Nick, we were thrilled that you were willing to really teach us about it. And I learned a little bit about you today. I mean, I knew you were a poet, but I didn't know how incredibly prolific and how well respected you are as a poet. So I'm excited to tell you that I just purchased Gravel and Hawk, and I wish I had done that a little sooner, so I could talk about it for a few more minutes. But it looks like a great book, and there's something. One of the people who gave you commentary, I just want to read this because it so reminds me of one of the themes really in our Storytellers exhibit. So this person, Kelly Sherry, says, Nick Norwood's newest collection is both beautifully restrained and intensely local. With impeccable craftsmanship, he delineates a farm, a family, neighbors, a place, and a time. Yet something else is going on. The particulars of the poem gather a subterranean strength, and by the book's end, we are shocked to realize how attached we have become to another's memories, and how those memories have taken up residence in our own minds. I mean, and I think, Kara, I mean, if that's sort of isn't something that you could say about the haters, you know, some of the people in this exhibit are local Nyack, local stories, and they just enter your heart and stay there. So Nick, please tell us a little bit about how Carson got to Nyack, what life was like for her in Nyack, and what had her decide to write a book. And we look forward to learning more about the book from you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mimi. That was very kind of you. And thank you for organizing this. Thank you for Loretta and Tracy and all the folks who are involved. I'm really happy to be here. And thank you for inviting me. As I said, I'm excited to talk about this book. I talk about Carson McCullers all the time. In fact, this is a first for me. This is my second presentation today. I gave a presentation on Carson McCullers at a conference in Atlanta this morning. So this is a double header for me, but so it's two firsts, a double header, and also I'm talking for the first time about this particular book, and I'm excited to do so. I'm going to do a share screen so that because I have some slides that I want you all to see, and They are related to the Carson McCullers Center and to Carson McCullers. Here's something I want to just start with right away, and that is that the Carson McCullers Center for Writers and Musicians is an outreach unit of Columbus State University. We have two facilities. We have Carson McCullers' childhood home in Columbus, Georgia, where I am now. And we have Carson's adult home in Nyack, New York at 131 South Broadway. And I'll talk a little bit more and I'll answer some questions later if folks have things they would like to ask about what we're planning to do with the house in Nyack. I thought I might also start with a little bit about who Carson McCullers was, just to make sure everyone understands. She was born here in Columbus in 1917. She died in Nyack in 1967, and she is buried in Oak Hill Cemetery in Nyack, not very far from Edward Hopper, in fact. She published the novel The Heart is a Lonely Hunter in 1940 when she was 23 years old. And if you've ever read that book, it is astonishing that anyone so young could have written it. But she became instantly well known in the literary world, sort of an instant celebrity. And then within 1 year, she published her second book, Reflections in a Golden Eye, made into a really famous movie with Marlon Brando and Elizabeth Taylor. And then she published in 1946 the book, The Member of the Wedding, which was then made into a play at the suggestion of her friend Tennessee Williams, and it ran for 500 performances on Broadway. And she published in 1951 The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. And those are the works for which she has become famous. The thing about Carson McCullers, I think that a lot of people attach to her is the sort of, she's a champion of tolerance and understanding and empathy. And one of the first reviews of that first book was by Richard Wright, the famous Harlem Renaissance novelist, who published a review in the New Republic. And it's an impressive review altogether. But one of the things he says is, to me, the most impressive aspect of this book is the astonishing humanity that enables a white writer for the first time in Southern fiction to handle Negro characters with as much ease and justice as those of her own race. And that's a quote that has followed Carson McCullers all of these years, and I think it's still true. And it's one of the things that separates her from some other famous writers of that period, Southern writers like Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor and Eudora Welty and so forth. But it's the reason, for instance, that Oprah Winfrey chose that book for her book club some years back and made it a bestseller all over again. And the reason she chose it is it was recommended to her by McCullers' fellow Georgian, Julia Roberts. Oprah Winfrey asked her, "What's a great book I should put on my list?" And she said, Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. But there are many other champions, including Hilton Als, the New Yorker critic, who was here in 2017, that same year of the 100th birthday year, and gave a talk on McCullers. He's a big fan. He's written on her. I gave him a tour of the house in Columbus, this is very interesting to me. He says, "Can a white writer, a woman who came to maturity in relatively secure circumstances during the Depression and the Second World War, be described as Africanist in spirit? In some circles, this would be called having soul." I think he is among a lot of contemporary writers and critics who hold her in really high regard. One is Sarah Schulman, writer and gay rights activist, who published a piece on McCullers in the New Yorker in 2016. And she was addressing in that this issue of cultural appropriation, which is something that novelists really have to struggle with these days. This idea of, for instance, white writers writing about characters who are not white. And Sarah Schulman admits that she had been challenged on this issue by some of her closest friends. And so she realized that it's something she had to struggle with. And because if you want to be a fiction writer, you're going to have to do that. And yet, how can you do it with sensitivity? Well, what she says is that coincidence of experience in combination with a hugely original natural talent, with an organic understanding of the difference between justice and injustice, and with a writerly lens of a dreamlike surrealistic quality, much like the hanging heat of West Georgia, produced a model writer white writer for all of us to learn from. Basically, what she says in that piece is that if you want to know how to write about people who are unlike yourself, maybe you should look closely at how Carson McCullers did it. Again, I think, it's pretty high praise. And this from a fairly recent piece in the New York Times by Jesmyn Ward, recent winner of the National Book Award. They asked her, which classic novel did you recently read for the first time? Carson McCullers' The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. The richness of her characters was so impressive and instructive. I loved that they had such complicated interior lives and poetic vision, but then spoke to each other in a language that was real and true. Many of you may have been at a concert we put on in Nyack in October of 2019 by Suzanne Vega. And Suzanne Vega is another huge fan of McCullers, and she actually did a whole album called Lover Beloved, Songs from an Evening with Carson McCullers. It's a very interesting story about how she came to associate and relate to Carson McCullers, but she's another one who holds McCullers in high regard. There's Karen Allen, who was in Raiders of the Lost Ark and a lot of other great films, another big fan of McCullers, who made her directorial debut film, a short film adaptation of the McCullers story, A Tree, a Rock, a Cloud. And we had her here in Columbus to premiere that film for the 100th birthday celebration in 2017. And then we brought that to the Rockland, the Rockland Film Society? I think I'm forgetting the name right now. But I'm sorry? Rivertown, thank you. Rivertown Film Society. And we screened that film, and also the film of Christy Zia, who is a Nyack native, and she directed a film based on a McCullers story as well. And we screened both of those films and had them there to introduce their films. And then I just love showing this picture. That's Rachel Weisz and Daniel Craig standing in front of the house there at 131 South Broadway. And the way that meeting came to pass was that in October of 2019, Rachel Weisz sent me an email and said, I'm in Atlanta making a film. I'm a huge fan of Carson McCullers. I wrote my thesis about her at Cambridge. She's dear to my heart, and I would love to come to Columbus and tour her home. And I said, by all means. And then as it turned out, her film schedule wouldn't allow it. And so I said, well, how would you like to come to her house in Nyack, New York? She said, I would very much. So we arranged a time when I was going to be in Nyack, which turned out to be December 2019. And at the appointed hour, she came in the front foyer, and I heard her British voice say hello. And I came out to greet her. And she said, I hope you don't mind, I brought my husband. And then I turned, and there was James Bond. And we sat there in the house in Nyack for 2 hours and talked about Carson McCullers. And she quoted me lines from McCullers. And they were just very charming and very warm and friendly, and obviously had a deep interest in McCullers and in Nyack, in Carson's life in Nyack. And so it's a wonderful thing. And she's like a lot of people. She said, I can't believe that Carson McCullers is not more well known, but she's just such, well, as she put it, she's dear to my heart. And she said she has been since I first read her as a teenager in London in the 80s. That's a group of students at Sofia University in Bulgaria. And the faculty there had me come to Bulgaria to talk to students and then to give a talk at a conference about Carson McCullers. And I think I'm always surprised at the people from around the world who are McCullers fans and who come to Columbus, for instance, to get a tour of the house and to be in the town where Carson grew up and where so many of her stories are set. In fact, I gave a tour of the house today to a scholar from Sweden who has started to publish on Carson McCullers, and he came to Georgia to be part of a conference and then to come to Columbus to see the house and to do some work in our archives about McCullers. All right, now I need to say some things about Carson's life and about how she came to Nyack. When Carson was 17 and she graduated from high school here in Columbus, she wanted to be famous, and so she went to New York. And she took some writing classes. She eventually met a fellow named Reeves McCullers here in Columbus, and they married. And then she had to deal with Houghton Mifflin, and she published that book, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. But something that had happened earlier in her life, in her teenage years, became more important to what the trajectory of her life, and that is that she had rheumatic fever, and it damages the heart. And Carson was a heavy drinker and a heavy smoker, which is about the worst thing that you can do. And so she had her first stroke when she was in her 20s. And she had more strokes throughout her 30s. By the time she was in her 30s, she was partially paralyzed on part of her body, on one side of her body. And at that point, well, by 1944, after her father died and her mother sold the house here in Columbus, they bought a house in Nyack. And the reason that they wound up in Nyack is that one of the first people that Carson met when she moved to New York after graduating from high school was Henry Varnum Poor, the artist Henry Varnum Poor, and they remained friends for the rest of her life. And after her father died and she and her mother wanted to find a place to live that was close to the city, but not right in the city, Henry Varnum Poor says, I know just the place. And so that's how they wound up in Nyack. And they first lived in Greystone Manor, I think it was called, the apartment building that burned down. And then they bought the house there at 131 South Broadway. As Carson's life went on through her 30s and 40s, she had many troubles in her marriage with Reeves. They married and divorced twice. He committed suicide in a hotel room in Paris in 1953. And even though she had had that great burst of creativity between 1937 and 1946, when she wrote all of those books for which she's now famous, she was having real difficulty finishing the novel that she was working on that wound up being her last novel, Clock Without Hands, which she eventually published in 1961. At the recommendation of Tennessee Williams, she finally saw a psychiatrist. He wanted her to see a psychiatrist, and she didn't want to do that because she was afraid that it would be damaging to her creative process. And also because of her disability, she walked with a cane at that point. It was difficult for her to get in and out of the city. And then someone recommended a child psychiatrist in Nyack named Dr. Mary Mercer. And Dr. Mercer had her practice in Nyack. She lived in a house up on Tweed Boulevard in Grandview on Hudson, up there on the bluff. And so Carson liked that idea, liked, I think, several things about it. First of all, that it was a woman. Secondly, that she was a child psychiatrist. And thirdly, that she was in Nyack. So Carson began to see Dr. Mercer, and they immediately developed a really strong rapport. And Carson was her patient for some months, and then they dissolved that relationship, and then they just had a very, very close personal relationship. The nature of that relationship is something that's much debated today. Some people would say that they were close friends. Others thought that they were lovers. I've talked to people who knew Mary well and don't believe that the latter was true. But there have been many books and many articles written on that subject. But whatever the case, it was Mary who, first of all, found the physician that determined that it had been rheumatic fever all those years ago that had caused these problems. It was originally diagnosed by the doctor in Columbus as pneumonia. And they found a physician that determined that it had been rheumatic fever, that this was a problem. Mary became her sort of health advocate and helped her to find doctors to help her. And she finally finished that last novel, Clock Without Hands, while sitting on Mary's sofa up there on Tweed Boulevard with her typewriter on Mary's coffee table. And we have those items here at the house in Columbus. And then Carson, even though she was able to finally finish that book, she was not really able to finish any other serious writing after that. The physical strain had become so much that she literally physically could not write. She had done her last writing, with the one finger at a time method on a typewriter. And it got to the point where she couldn't even do that. Just before this session started, we were talking about her autobiography, that parts of which she actually dictated. She was having people take dictation as a way of continuing to write, and it was a big struggle. But doing something as as demanding as writing a novel, or even writing a really good short story that was up to her standard, became impossible. And so it seemed that her writing career was over. But she was writing what she called verses to the children of her attorney, Floria Lasky, and her children were named Emily Altman and Dara Altman, and to the child of her agent, Robbie Lance, his son, Tony Lance. And she was just writing these little verses, as she called them, on little note cards and sending them to these children because she loved children. And it's a thing about Carson that I think is part of her appeal, is that she wrote very well about childhood. And she reminds me a little in that regard of someone like J.D. Salinger. And I think Carson is like Salinger in that a lot of people come to her work as young people, and they recognize their own feelings and their own struggles in her writing, and then they become really attached to her. That was certainly the case with Rachel Weisz. It was the case with Karen Allen, and the case with a lot of people I've met who have become lifelong devotees of Carson's work. Mick Kelly, for instance, in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, the 12-year-old girl who wants to be a famous pianist, but whose family is too poor to even own a piano. Or Frankie Adams, who's searching for the we of me, that group of people of which she feels she can belong. And so there was a genius about McCullers, that she could not only remember what it was like to be a child, but render that on the page in a way that seemed true and that seemed to really reveal something about what it's like to be a young person. What Rachel Weisz said to me that day is that she said, I feel like Carson McCullers, when I was a teenager, she knew exactly what it was to be me, to be a young girl, going through what young girls go through when they're 12 and 13 years old. And that's why she formed that lifelong attachment. And people who knew Carson well said that there was about her a very childlike quality, a sort of sense of wonder, a sense of humor, a way of looking at the world. And I think also a kind of empathy that unfortunately so many of us grow out of, a kind of empathy that only young people have. A way of accepting other people and being tolerant of other people. And so those were all qualities that I think went into this book that she wrote for children. But the way the book that came about was that she didn't set out to write a book for children. It's that I think it was probably Robbie Lance showed some of these verses that she had written for his son to an editor at Houghton Mifflin. That was McCullers' publishing house throughout her career. And the editor was significantly interested and said, I'd like to see some more of these. And so some more of them were sent to her. And she said, okay, I would like to have you, Carson, write a whole book of these. So then, and this is another interesting thing for folks in Nyack, I think, and people at the library, at that point, Carson had divided that house at 131 South Broadway into 5 apartments. That was at the suggestion of Tennessee Williams. And this was after the success of first the novel, The Member of the Wedding, and then especially its run on Broadway, which was Carson's biggest financial windfall. And she was able to fulfill a lifelong dream and buy a house outside of Paris. And her mother was still living at the house at 131. And Tennessee Williams apparently said, that's way more house than your mother needs, and way more house even than you all need when all of you are there. You ought to divide the house into apartments And then you can rent out some of the apartments and only occupy one. And that way you'll have a steady income and you can spend more of your time with your writing. So that's what she did. Apparently, Tennessee Williams also helped pay for the renovations. And many of you may know, to this day, the house is still divided into 5 apartments. Anyway, one of the apartments was rented to a librarian at Nyack High School named Kenneth French. And I don't know
You
if
know him.
Yeah, Kenneth French. Yeah, he was living in the basement apartment at 131 South Broadway. And apparently Carson, as I said, she had not planned to write a children's book, and she had found it difficult to write anything. And she enlisted him to help her sort of put together this collection of verses. And I don't know exactly what he did. I don't know if he helped her with individual poems or if he just helped her select the ones that she would eventually put into the book. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting tie-in. I'm going to just talk about a few of the poems that I can relate to other aspects of Carson's life. This one, October Fair. At the fair in October, folks come from all over. The whole town is there at the October Fair, eating hot dogs with mustard and frozen custard and riding on things, Ferris wheels and swings. You spend your good money to make you feel funny at the fair, On sunny afternoons and nights with harvest moons, we eat and ride together at the October Fair. And the reason that one sticks out to me is that it's a part of Carson's own life. When she was a little girl here in Columbus in the 20s and 30s, one of her favorite things to do was to go to the fair. One of the things that she liked to do, and I think no surprise to people who know her fiction well, is to go to the freak shows. It was something that was absolutely fascinating to her, but just the whole environment of the fair, the lights, and the smells and the feeling you get from riding the rides and the different things that you see that was so out of the ordinary. And it's a part of the book, The Member of the Wedding. There is a scene in which young Frankie goes to the fair. It's also a part of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, where Jake Blunt ends up, he's a mill worker, but he gets a job running one of the rides at the Dixie Fair there in that southern mill town. Let's see. This is something funny to me, and I want to ask you guys a question. If this is something that's part of New York culture as well, but in this poem, The Golden Egg Gobbler, these first lines: we have a dog called Count, but Daddy calls him No Count. And I just wondered, that is I always thought of as a Southern term, no count. Is that a term that's used in New York to say of someone disparagingly that he or she is no count? Has anyone ever heard that?
No.
No. Okay. Well, see, there you go. That is
I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a Southern thing. That's something my grandfather would say. It would refer to somebody as no count. And it's a funny story about that other Southern writer, William Faulkner, who, by the way, became Carson's friend. She was a long admirer. And when she lived in Nyack, near the end of Faulkner's life, he had a visiting professor or visiting writer gig at West Point, and he gave a reading. And someone took Carson from the house there in Nyack to West Point to be there for his reading. And when he saw her in the audience, he came through the crowd to embrace her and said, "Oh, my daughter has come to see me." But when he was, before he became famous, in Oxford, Mississippi, where he was from, he was referred to as Count No Count because he was not thought well of by people in his community. So anyway, that to me is something that stuck out as a particular sort of Southern expression that turns up in that little poem. As I was saying earlier, I think one of the things about Carson McCullers that has made her so relevant today, her books deal with issues having to do with, for instance, racism, with gender fluidity, and sexual orientation. And she was way ahead of the curve in that regard. And books like The Heart is a Lonely Hunter that have characters. It's just astonishing that somebody writing in the 1930s could create these characters and to talk about them in ways that appeal to us today. I think is a way to put it. One of the things that Hilton Als and has addressed is that there are things in some of her books that make us cringe a little bit, and he addressed the things about, for instance, African Americans that she says that he thinks, well, you know, there it is. She can't help. She can't be completely innocent of the culture that she grew up in. But he says you feel that there's this underlying empathy that allows you to forgive her in certain cases. I think this poem, One World, is a good example of that very thing. It says, one world or none, they say it will be. In the world, there are furry Eskimos, red Indians with arrows and bows, black people, white people, red people, yellow people. I like these different differences. I would not like the world to be just one. But if there were no world, as they say there might be, what would happen to you and to me? And I think that verse sort of encapsulates what Hilton Als was said. I mean, some of those things give us pause. Red Indians, for instance. I mean, that's certainly not PC. But I think there is still in the poem, you see sort of that empathy. I like these different differences. I would not like the world to be just one. I think that's something that comes through in all of Carson McCullers' writing, and it's the thing that separates her from Flannery O'Connor, for instance, and William Faulkner. It's one of the things that Richard Wright talked about in that first review in the New Republic. The thing about Faulkner is definitely he exposes racism in the South for the horror that it is, and he is absolutely scathing and you know, he is brutally honest about it. But you also suspect that it's not empathy that drives him to do it. It's just a sort of honesty that he had as an artist that had him to do it. And it's the same with Flannery O'Connor. And Carson McCullers, it's different. There seems to be a real sort of empathy. No one can quite explain where it came from, how she was able to imagine herself into the lives of people who were so different from herself. One theory, and this is one that, for instance, the gay rights activist Sarah Schulman puts forth, is that because Carson was herself sexually ambivalent, and because she was different, she was seen as kind of a freak. She was tall, she wore men's clothing, she smoked cigarettes on the street, she hung out in beer halls in Phoenix City, Alabama. She obviously didn't care about the things that young Southern girls were supposed to care about. She read books all the time. And so she was othered by people in her town. She was outside of the mainstream. She knew what it was like, you know, to be othered in that way. And that was maybe the thing that allowed her to imagine what it was like to be a person of a different race or a different gender or a different sexual orientation, or to have a certain kind of disability, because that's another thing that, again, she was way ahead of the curve. You know, one of our main characters in The Heart is Lonely Hunter is the potentially homosexual, deaf mute Jewish man, John Singer, who's one of her most brilliant characters, I think. And, you know, it's a question, how was she able to imagine herself into that life so convincingly and so brilliantly and beautifully? Well, Sarah Schulman offers that as a possible answer for how she was able to do so. But I think it's the real thing about Carson McCullers that separates her from a lot of other writers, and I think makes her relevant today. And also the thing that makes her so beloved by so many people today. Here's another example of that in this little verse, A Rat and a Rainbow. This afternoon, the sun shone while it showered. This afternoon, there was a rainbow. Bands of orange, gold, and red, like many colored flowers, bent in a big bow across the sky. Children ran across wet grass, pointing at the rainbow, shouting, "Look, oh my." Why is it rude to point at people, but not to point at a rat or a rainbow? it makes me think of the famous passage in the letters of the British poet John Keats, who came up with this term negative capability. And he says in this letter that a writer who sees a sparrow pecking through pebbles on the ground needs to be able to imagine what it's like to be that sparrow. Nay, he needs to be able to imagine what it's like to be the pebble. And Keats says, that's the capacity that great writers have. He says Shakespeare had it in spades. That ability to imagine himself as someone completely different, to empathize with anyone or even anything. He says, read the works of William Shakespeare and ask yourself, where is William Shakespeare? He is nowhere. And I think that Carson McCullers had that same ability. And it makes me think of that, and that why is it rude to point at people, but not to point at a rat or a rainbow? When I read this book, and I'm like a lot of people who read books and love books and then have children and find themselves developing a taste in children's literature, something I thought I would never, I never anticipated. But when my children were little and I was reading them books, every day and every night, my son was one of those kids where he would have a favorite book and he would want to have it read to him 2 or 3 times a day, every day for 6 weeks. Believe me, you can get too much of green eggs and ham after a while because of that. But you find yourself developing a taste in children's books, and finding, becoming a kind of critic of children's books. And so in reading this book by Carson McCullers, what comes across to me, the thing that first strikes me is that childlike quality that McCullers has that comes through in this book. I mean, the book is kind of silly, and there's a sort of childlike quality about every piece in it. And I think that it was a mark of Carson McCullers as a writer and as a person that she was able to tap into that. I mean, it's the kind of thing where it looks like, oh, anybody could do that, but don't try this at home. It's not so easy. And I think it comes through in the last verse in the book. This one's called "I Am Old and Can Remember." In autumn, the days are blue and gold. The trees are bright, the days are cold. The leaves fall whirling in the air, whirling and dancing in the windy air. The leaves are gone after a night of wind and rain. The trees are bare. I wake up scared. Are the trees dead? But I am old. I can remember when trees look dead in cold November. Green, green spring, I can remember. Cruci, Kazuchi, Kaluchi, Kazine. When you fall off a black cliff, soft as a feather, and open your eyes to bright weather, you've been asleep. When you are chased by a bad man in bogging sand, you've had a nightmare and wake up scared. When roses flower in a blizzard and houses are queer as the houses of wizards, you've had a dream. What is the meaning of a dream? Cruci, Kazuchi, Kaluchi, Kazine. This is the meaning of a dream. So, that is basically what I have to say about Carson and her book, Sweet as a Pickle, Clean as a Pig. But I would be happy to talk more about it with folks, or to answer any questions that you guys might have about Carson, or about her book, or about her life in Nyack, or about the Carson McCullers Center in Nyack. So.
Well, I have to say, boy, what a treat. And I'm so thrilled that we're recording it, because I think there are going to be so many more people who are going to absolutely adore this seminar that you gave us. Okay, now I just need to, I think it was a clapping I'm seeing, huh? So I guess we just need, for those of you who are, I'm not so good at this part of when I can't see your hand, but Tracy, we'll see that on the participants? Is that how it goes?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any questions just yet.
Well, Loretta, you have a question, right? You need to unmute.
Yes. Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I feel as if I know her so much better now.
Good.
But I wonder the status of the house in Nyack, who lives there and how do they get to live there?
Well, it's an interesting story. We have a property management firm now that handles that, but for many years, Mary Mercer handled that. And what happened was, after Carson divided the house into apartments, and the house was willed to her estate, and then it was sold. And Mary was afraid, because it was being used as an apartment house, that it was not going to be kept up, and that the fact that it was the house of Carson McCullers was not going to be something that was, was maintained. And so she decided to buy it herself and to then lease out the apartments to people who were interested in the arts, like Kenneth French, right, a librarian. And so I have met a number of people in Nyack who told me that they had at one time rented an apartment there. And what you had to do was you had to go up to 5 Tweed and sit in Mary Mercer's living room and be interviewed. And they said you had to bone up on your Carson McCullers. If you had not read the works of Carson McCullers, forget it. You were not going to get one of those apartments. So, it was like an oral exam that you had to take. And one of the people who lives there was one of the people who was, she originally leased it from Mary Mercer. Carol has been there, I think, for about 30 years. And so at this point, you don't have to be an artist or a writer to rent space there. You just have to, deal with the property management firm when there has an apartment available. But what we are going to do is basically to fulfill Mary Mercer's vision. She wanted the house in Nyack to become, as she called it, sort of a mini Yaddo. And you may know that Carson was someone for whom Yaddo meant a lot to her career. She spent a lot of time there. She finished the novel, The Member of the Wedding at Yaddo in 1946. And so that is something that we want to do. Eventually, we're going to take a complete possession of the house. I mean, we already have possession, but we're no longer going to have tenants there. And we are going to have artist, writer, musician, scholar residencies available for those apartments. The main floor apartment we will always use, and we'll have a site director there, and we will have cultural programming there, like some of the things that we've already done. We've had a number of poetry readings there. Usually in collaboration with River Writer Circle, but we've had people like David Means and Bethany Ball there, Sigrid Nunez there. And so we're going to continue to do those sorts of things, but we're also going to be using it as an artist, writer residency space. And then in the summers, we're going to have faculty and students from Columbus State University come and live and learn in the house. And it will be a great, facility in that regard, because it's so close to the city, and the students can then, go on field trips to all the museums in Manhattan and so forth. So that's sort of our plan for it. And we are currently working on building endowments for the house to make all of that possible. We're about to do some renovations there. And, that's been a long time coming, but we're actually coming up in July with the head of CSU facilities maintenance to look at some things that we need to do. We're meeting with some folks about, doing some maintenance and repairs on the house and that sort of thing. But we are hoping in the very near future to be able to start operating it as an artist and writer residency space. So
Nice, very nice.
Yeah.
I have another question if no one else does. At Mary Mercer's house, number 5 Tweed Boulevard, is that still there, that house?
It is still there. After Mary died, the house was sold, and I don't know who it is that lives there. But I was there at the house just very recently with a very close friend of Mary's, Joan Mertens. And she actually wanted, Joan is very forward. She wanted for the folks who lived there to let us in so we could see the house, which I was a little embarrassed. But when we knocked on the door, no one was there. But the house is still there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was just going to ask if anyone else, I know Lee Lee remembers Ken French. And do you remember him, Loretta? Or is there anyone else on the call that remembers him?
Yeah, I mean, I taught in the high school for a couple years. French not only was the librarian, but he was also part of a social group that we had dinner with probably once or twice a month.
Yeah.
And has he died at this point?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say I would love to been able to talk to him, and you know, it's very difficult at this point to find people who knew Carson well as an adult. I know some people who met her when they were children, but I met one fellow, John Ziegler, who died a few years back, and the reason I was able to meet him is he lived a very long life. He died at age 101. But he was one of the last people, including people like Edward Albee and Mary Mercer. You know, Mary Mercer died at age 102. Who knew Carson well. And yeah, most of them have passed. By the way, I wanted to thank you very much, Lee Hoffman, for making those beautiful scans of the book, because they are terrific. And I'm very happy to have them because, as I said, the book is really hard to find. And that copy, by the way, that you used was one that was found by one of my advisory board members at a library book sale. And she just happened to stumble on it, and she bought it.
Okay.
And she said, I thought the McCullough Center ought to have this. And I said, thank you very much. They're very rare items.
Right. Mhm.
Yeah, but thank you very much for those scans.
I was glad to be able to do it.
Thanks.
You know, I would like to see if there are people around, like, for instance, Lee, I'm thinking of Sue Veltri, that knew Ken fairly well, although it would be interesting also to see who might have been in the English department who would have talked to him about Carson McCullough.
Mhm.
I think it's
Mhm.
possible that some of those people may still exist in Nyack.
Hmm.
So that would
Well,
be
you know, a
interesting.
few years back, with I think it was the Nyack Historical Society, you have like a parade of homes sort of thing. I forget what you call it.
House tour.
House
Right.
tour.
Right.
And you guys asked me if I could put the Carson McCullough's house, and I was just very happy to do that. And you know, so I was there all day and meeting folks who were coming in. It was very nice. And there was a woman who came in, and there were so many people, I was not able to pursue this conversation, but she said, you know, I've been in this house before. And I said, oh, you were here for some events? And she said, no, I was here when Carson was alive. And I said, really?
Mhm.
And she said, she was basically what we now call an EMT. And she
Mhm.
said, I came in and got Carson and took her to the hospital on more than one occasion.
Right.
And I said, were you there the fatal last night? She said, no, I wasn't. But I did, you know, I did actually meet her and came in and took her to the hospital. And as I said, because there were other people and I was not able to pursue that conversation, but I wish I had at least gotten her name. I would
I
love
think
to
we
talk to
have
her.
it. I
Do
think
we?
we have it because I would have to do some digging, but we were all excited to learn that.
Mhm.
And I think probably if we look at that house tour record, we may well be able to figure it out.
I would love that. If we could find that out and I
Well,
could,
you know
Sure.
who else? It's possible that the Nyack Community Ambulance Corps,
Hmm.
but I think it was in existence back then, and so they may have been the ones who responded. So they may have records also.
Mhm.
So, you know, we can check with them for you.
that would be wonderful.
Mhm.
That would be wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.
So who, like I know Ken French was living there 1969, 1970, 71.
Mhm.
Were there other recognizable tenant artists or?
Well, the
Who-
artist
who lived
Mariel
there?
Banku, lived there for a while, and I don't know if you all know her, but she was an artist that came to America, and she lived in, was it Greystone Manor? Was that the name of the apartment building that burned down? It was It was right next to 131. It's where the building I refer to as the cat house, the cat hospital.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
there was an apartment building there. That's actually where Carson and her mother originally lived when they moved to Nyack. And then I think the house at 131, which was right next door, became available and they bought it. But one night, and I don't remember what year this is, that apartment building burned down. And it was in the middle of the night, and Carson invited the tenants who were turned out of their house into her house, because I think it was like a snowy night in Nyack. And Mariel Banku was apparently one of those people. And she and Carson became very close friends. In fact, we have a filmed interview that a fellow did with Mariel Banku about her relationship with Carson, but she lived in the house for a while. And I don't know, for those of you who have been there, we have in the front foyer of the house a sketch portrait of Carson McCullers by the Hungarian artist of French extraction, Marcel Berthès. There's also a copy of it behind the cash register at Pickwick Books, which I love. Of course, you know, there's so many books stacked in front of it, sometimes you can barely see it. But anyway, but the original of that belonged to Mariel Banku. Carson willed it to her. And then when Mariel Banku passed, she had willed it to us. So we now have it here at the house in Columbus, the original, and we have a reproduction there in its original spot at the house in Nyack. But she's somebody else that I know that lived in the house. Yeah.
Yeah, we can check with Win Perry about the greystone and the fire.
Mhm.
You know,
He would know.
he would know.
Yes.
For sure.
So when do you know when the house was built and who the original
I believe
owners
it's
were?
yeah, I believe it was 1880. You know, it was the rectory for the church across the street when it was built.
Okay.
That church across the street from the house, and I believe I have that right. It was 1880, and then was significantly added on to in like 1910. I had never noticed that, but people who know a lot more about architecture can look at that house and tell the ways that it was added onto. And there were a number of things that were changed about it in about 1910. But yeah, it was built, I think the year was 1880. Mm-hmm. I have a great picture of that house when, from the pictures, it almost looks like there are no other houses around it except for Greystone Manor that's beside it, and there are none of the trees, and it's just standing out there by itself. It's kind of an amazing picture of early Nyack.
We would love it if you could.
Yeah, I have a copy of it, and I think I have maybe a digitalized version of that. I could send it to you as well.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
That would be great.
Nick, this is Win Perry.
Hey,
Can you hear? Hi.
yes, hi,
He's going to tell us.
yeah,
The house that burned was called Gray Court,
Gray Court. Okay,
Court, and there's a good history of the Nyack Fire Department in the library here in Nyack. We can look up whether there's any pertinent information in it.
sure.
My wife Betty, who is recovering from a couple of strokes herself and is dozed off next to me here, on one occasion took the altar flowers from Grace Episcopal Church to Carson after the service at the request of the altar guild, and had a brief visit with her. We also were personal friends of Anthony and Eliant Macomb, Macombe. He was a Episcopal priest from Haiti who lived in the apartment over the garage.
Okay. When was that?
Perhaps it was after Mary Mercer's death.
Mm.
I mean, after Carson McCullers' death.
Mhm. Good. I'm always interested to gather as much of that information as I can. And I am not the world's foremost expert on Carson McCullers by any means. That would be a fellow named Carlos Dews, who was the founder of the center. And as the world's foremost McCullers scholar, he edited both volumes of the Library of America's collected works of Carson McCullers. He edited that unfinished autobiography we were talking about earlier. He's the one who found the manuscript in the archives at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin. And he is currently working on the complete letters, or the collected letters, of Carson McCullers.
Wow.
And so he is a good source for a lot of information. But, you know, there are lots of things like the things that you were just telling me that he doesn't know. Because I'll ask him, I said, hey, do you know this? I'll send him an email. He goes, no, I don't. And so we're always, excited to be able to uncover some of those tidbits.
Ken French was the high school.
Nick, I remember
We're
hearing.
students at Nyack High School.
Mm.
And they always referred to him as a interesting and friendly character. Unusual man.
When were you talking about Ken French? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, my sense was that I think Ken French was pretty authentic about being gay. And this was in the, what, about 1970? And funny. Funny. And also, I think pretty, I don't know what the right word is, opinionated.
Well, I bet he and Carson McCullers got along fine then.
Yeah.
Hi, Nick. I have a question. It's of course an absolute pleasure. You're a treasure to the Nyack community.
Thank you.
I'm a literature major myself, and I've always been curious about Carson's influence in postmodern literature, because you do kind of get that raw and grotesque aspect, almost the underbelly of American literature. I was wondering if you knew of any, strong, distinct genealogies, shall we say, from Carson to maybe authors like Thomas Pynchon or William Gaddis, who lived in Piermont.
Yeah, no, I've never heard of anything like that, of those writers of that sort of the high postmodernists that you're talking about. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that there is some that, but it's really a funny thing, because her influence, I think, is harder to discern. It comes out usually when the writers sort of admit it themselves, and you're sometimes surprised to find out what writers have been influenced by her. I'm thinking of, suddenly his name escapes me. There was a famous Irish writer, a short story writer, who died just a few years ago. One of those rare writers these days who wrote almost exclusively short stories, like our own David Means, right? There in Nyack. But he said that he had been a long admirer of Carson McCullers. And I don't think among those postmodernists of that era, that those are not the writers I think of so much as having been influenced by her. But people like Jesmond Ward, you can sort of see the influence in a writer like that. And I think it has to do with writing about the grotesque, and something that is in sort of that Southern Gothic strain. Yeah. But there's this fellow John, I want to say it's Denioff. He's a novelist, and he was one of the writers for Game of Thrones.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, yeah, heavily influenced by Carson McCullers. And I saw one of those pieces that they run in the New York Times with writers. They said, tell us your 10 favorite books. And one of his favorite books was Remember the Wedding. And he said, yeah, my wife and I both loved that book so much, we named our daughter Frankie.
Wow.
And so, yeah, there you go. I mean, I would take from that probably McCullers was somewhat an influence on him, and one of the writers of this TV version of Game of Thrones. So there you go.
Well, this has been such a treat. I would say maybe one more question, and then we'll say goodnight and thank you very, very much. I did put in the chat, I didn't realize it, but I put it in 3 times thinking it wasn't pasting, in case you want to think of this as an armchair tour where we would usually put in $5 or $10 to help support the society. There's a link there. And the other thing I have is a link so you can learn more about Nick and his books. And because, boy, you are a treasure that
Well,
we're so happy to,
oh,
you know,
thank you.
really, we're really, really happy that we were able to reach out to you, and you were so generous with your time and
Yeah.
and the
Well,
McCullers
thank you
Center.
so much. And I'm serious about that. And believe me, the Carson McCullers Center wants to get engaged in Nyack as much as we can. We want to collaborate with the library, with the Historical Society, with the Hopper House, in every way that we can. We want to integrate ourselves into that community. So always happy to do things like this. Absolutely.
Well, we're delighted. And if the students are coming up during the summer in the future, that it would be really fun to figure out a way to, you know, collaborate.
Yep, absolutely.
So
Okay,
thank you all
you
for
so much,
coming.
Nick.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you, Mimi
everybody.
and Nick, for making this
Okay.
happen.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Thanks
Bye-bye.
a lot, Nick.
Okay.